I think at this point we can pretty much get underway. I'm Brendan Dooley, Professor of Renaissance Studies at University College Cork. And as you have seen, we have a pretty packed program over the next 2 days. Quite a challenge, not only to put it together, but I suppose also to carry it off. And so thank you all for participating and collaborating. And I think I can just start by calling our first speaker to the virtual podium. And that is Dr. Niamh McGavin, his Assistant Dean of Research in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at University of Limerick, and a lecturer in the Department of History there, and chair of the Irish Humanities Alliance. And thank you so much, Niamh, for agreeing to do this, for coming along, and for everything else you've contributed to this event. Your turn.
Good morning, everyone, and I hope everyone is well this Monday morning. My name, as Brendan mentioned, is Niamh McGavin, and I'm from the Department of History at the University of Limerick, but also currently the chair of the Irish Humanities Alliance. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our annual conference organised this year by UCC. The conference is just one of the programme of activities organised by the IHA on an annual basis, and I would invite everyone to visit our website when you get a chance to get a sense of the work of the Alliance. The IHA was founded in 2013 as a joint initiative of the humanities researchers within 11 higher education and research institutions across the island of Ireland, including the Royal Irish Academy, which hosts and supports the IHA. Since its creation, the IHA has championed humanities research and scholarship in Ireland and Northern Ireland. The annual conference is a wonderful opportunity to consider key questions across multiple disciplines, to connect humanities researchers on the island of Ireland, but also to connect with colleagues internationally. And the Exciting News Conference is certainly a wonderful example of this. And I hope that some of the connections that are made through this conference will go on to shape further collaborations. I would like to just thank the organising committee who have had to deal with the changes brought about by COVID, and in particular Professor Brendan Twomey and Dr. Mel Farrell, Director of the IHA, who have worked really hard to bring this vibrant and exciting programme together. The range of topics across the 9 panels and the keynote address, which will be given today by Professor Jane Chapman from the University of Lincoln, reflect deep, sustained and nuanced exploration of how the idea of the news and the media landscape impact our lives, something that we are all increasingly aware of after a year of nightly mobile phone notifications and last-minute televised addresses to the nation. And while of course it is a shame that we cannot be all together in person, I hope that the move to an online platform has facilitated a broader audience, and I'm sure that people will be joining for panels throughout the day. So thank you all very much for your engagement with the Irish Humanities Alliance. Do follow us on social media. We're Irish Humanities on Twitter in particular. We're very active there. As Mel has shared the hashtag for today's conference, so do use that so that people can follow along if they're not able to actually attend. And do keep in touch with us via our website for future events. And just to say best of luck to everyone with the conference over the next 2 days. Gurv Malgriv.
Right, so thank you very much. I'll introduce the next speaker, who is Professor Chris Williams at UCC, who is the head of the College of Arts and also vice chair of the Irish Humanities Alliance. And thank you so much, Chris, for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Brendan, and it's a great pleasure as head of the College of Arts, Catholic Studies and Social Sciences to pour so much of my college budget into this event. I think in normal circumstances,
we do appreciate.
Yeah, we'd be probably having a wine reception and possibly lunches, buffet lunches, and the wonderful cuisine for which University College Cork is so famed. But I'm afraid I have have to ask all conference delegates to fall back on their own resources over the next 2 days instead. So yeah, thanks very much indeed for the introduction. I'm Chris Williams. I'm head of the College of Arts, Celtic Studies and Social Sciences at UCC. So I suppose, you know, I'm wearing 2 hats this morning in welcoming delegates. On the one hand, as head of the college, I would probably be here anyway, because my college includes all of the humanities disciplines within UCC, and we're very strong supporters of the Irish Humanities Alliance. When I took over this role back in 2017, I was really struck by how important the IHA is to a sense of community and connectedness, to networking, to advocacy for the humanities right across the island. Something that I think universities in other states and countries could make use of, that kind of model, because it's a really impressive way of bringing together the interests of researchers across different institutions in a very collegial way. So, you know, it's been a tremendous pleasure to be involved with the IHA, and a great honour for me to be vice chair this year of the IHA. Yeah, it's fantastic that we've got this conference at UCC, and you know, I'd like to signal that I was delighted that Brendan and his team put forward this theme for consideration. I ought to thank the conference organisers as well for scheduling me for 2 9 AM appearances, which means that I have to get out of bed. I can't do all of my Zoom and MS Teams call from the bedroom. I actually have to get dressed and shaved, ready for proceedings. And you know, I'm really looking forward to hearing lots of the different papers over the next 2 days. I know that virtual conferences are a different kind of beast from the ones that we would have in person, and you don't have the same opportunities perhaps to informally network and to sort of socialize and to enjoy the moments between papers. But on the other hand, as Niamh has said, it does give us opportunities to reach out to a very broad audience. You can obviously tune into this conference from wherever you are, and you can fit it in around your other commitments. So that's absolutely fantastic. And I think really that's all I need to say, and just perhaps to introduce the next person to the podium, who is Dr. Mel Farrell, Director of the IHA, who really keeps the IHA ticking over on a daily and weekly basis, and who has done a lot of work with Brendan, I know, to bring this conference to fruition. So again, great welcome to all delegates. Wish you were in UCC today, but let's hope that we can do this all again in the not too distant future. And over to Mal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your kind words. I'd just like to echo what the 2 IHA chairs have already said. So I'd like to welcome all delegates to this virtual event, Exciting News Event, Narration and Impact from Past to Present. I'd just like to add actually that this is the IHA's 5th annual conference. And this one, of course, is run in partnership with the EURONEWS project in UCC. And of course, we'd all much rather be in Cork today than in the virtual world, especially after hearing about the wonderful cuisine on offer there in Chris Williams' remarks. I'm afraid we won't have that on offer today virtually. I'd just like to say as well that just to add to what's already been said about the IHA, I just want to mention that the IHA launched a strategy for the humanities in 2019, By Imagination We Live, and I'd also urge you just to check that out on our website. I'd also like to add that, you know, we have a very productive relationship with key stakeholders in the Irish research ecosystem. We're an all-island body, and at a European level, we are also active members of EAT, the European Alliance for Social Sciences and Humanities. So we do work to promote the humanities, to showcase the humanities at a European and national level. Just again, I don't want to repeat what's already been said. So we have an excellent program today, which brings together researchers from Ireland and further afield with a range of humanities perspectives on the topic under discussion today and tomorrow. Just to remind you that you can follow us on Twitter at Irish Humanities, and we are using the hashtag #ExcitingNews2021 over the course of the two-day conference. So I think I'll now just hand over to Professor Brendan Dooley of UCC, who has worked very closely with us over the last number of months in putting together the program. I just want to say at this point, Brendan, it was lovely to work with you on this. Enjoyed it, and I think we can be very happy with how things have come together. So I'll just hand over to you now.
Righto. Well, thank you so much for this, Mel. And my task here actually is basically to render thanks to all those who have helped us put the program together and to make this happen. Indeed, to create the first application for UCC to be enabled to have this program. And so it's the people that you've just met, Mel, Chris, and Niamh, and also my co-organizer, Sandy Wilkinson at UCD. And also, of course, last but not least, the EURONEWS project team, who I see are all eagerly waiting to ask questions during the sessions. So it's Sarah Mansuti, who will be paying particularly close attention to the chat. I'll talk about that in just a second. Volta Kreuz, and Davide Boerio will be leading a panel soon. And Lorenzo Allori, who's looking after our project Twitter feed and tweeting to the hashtag, as we've just explained. Thanks to all, and especially thanks to our speakers who have agreed to, well, in some cases, get up early in the morning and participate in this lovely exercise of exchanging ideas. Maybe I'll just start by saying a couple things about how this thing came about and how we got interested in it. Well, part of it is actually due to the EuroNews project itself. And let me just say one or two words about that, since the name has come up repeatedly in our discussions so far this morning. And many of you may be wondering, what on earth? Well, here is what on earth. It is a project funded by the Irish Research Council for studying the origins of news. Very quickly, as we put together the information about the project and the grant application and so on for the IRC, we realized that the origins of news were explicable and understandable to us, especially from a comparative perspective. And this seemed to be a perspective that was kind of missing a little bit from studies of news, which often seem to be limited to single countries or single linguistic areas. We discovered that not only the documents that we were actually using in the Florence State Archive, which is up that way, which happen to be in diverse languages. So some of these early documents are in French and in Spanish, in German, and of course, many in Italian. And in attempting to understand this cosmopolitan mix, we realized not only did we have to compare across different cultures, different linguistic areas, and so on, but we also had to compare back and forth in time. How did the news change as the sort of modern media emerged, and how was it possible to understand the media of the past without the modern media in the back of our heads, sort of screaming at us. And in fact, the way we've organized this conference is we have both ends of the story and a good part of the middle. So we'll be talking a little bit about the origins, and we'll be also talking a little bit about the contemporary, what shall we say, Chris, predicament, I think, was what I gathered from what you were saying. And this is precisely what we'll be doing. The project, of course, is, when I say the origins of news, I mean those first Renaissance newsletters, which were handwritten messages copied up in many numbers and sent round to interested diplomats and circulated outside the diplomatic context into. We have evidence of the newsletters actually being read on the street. And I would show you a lovely woodcut of this in Bologna from the 17th century. But at the moment, I'm just asking you to imagine that. So it's a group sitting around an individual who's actually reading this newsletter aloud, which gives an idea of how the news spread in this early period. And of course, the diffusion of this news was entirely cosmopolitan, and the network that was created by this circulation crossed all geographic boundaries and involved, for instance, we find what must have been discussions of the Irish beef market on the streets of Florence, because there are newsletters actually that deal with relations between England and Ireland and the 17th century, which give a sense of a European spread, a European community of news in which Ireland was certainly figured as a part, as an item of news. So a continent-wide network is what we're studying, but we're also fascinated with the differences as well as the similarities between that network and that, let's say, context of news and our contemporary context of news. Certain features emerge. The three main pillars of, you might say, news studies or media studies are the three main pillars since the beginning. That is the production, the distribution, and the effect of news are the three main points that we'll be discussing very much in these next 2 days. Other features include truth and falsehood, fake news, extremely intricate problems and discussions about the circulation of news, whether it's true or false, already in the 16th century. And so these are sort of perennial issues that have made quite an impact in our contemporary, we might say, news context, but they are perennial features of the media history, the media story that we're talking about. And we got so interested in this comparison between past and present that we had a long discussion with Michael Shudson, who came over to our virtual conference center and helped us work out some of the theoretical aspects of what media are, what they do, what a narrative of a story might look like, and how this changes. Now, I thought I might, before going to the, let's say, practical aspects that I'm going to discuss in just a second in regard to the let's say, organization of these 2 days and how the speakers will be integrated with the heads of panels and so on, I just thought of bringing together 2 ends of our story. So on the one hand, we have that famous phrase that was, let's say, really brought into the public by a poem by Seamus Heaney, who spoke of the music of what happens. So in a way, that's exactly what news is. The narrative of news is actually the music of what happens. And this comes from, as many of you know, from a very old Irish story where there's the head of the clan is in a gathering with some of the clansmen, and it is asked, well, what is the greatest music of all? And so one says, well, it's the sound of a spear hitting a shield. Another one says, oh, it's the sound of the cuckoo in the trees. And they say, and the head of the clan looks a little perplexed. And they say, well, head of clan, what is the greatest music of all for you? And he says, it's the music of what happens. And so one of the points that Seamus Heaney makes in the poem that he does about this is that indeed is the narrative of life. So the origins of news really, in a way, from the origins of communities. And that brings us down to the other end of the question, I suppose, the very important insight of Hegel, where Hegel points out that by his time, in the turn of the 18th century, news had become what he says the secular morning prayer within our communities. It sort of had taken the place of religious ceremonies as being, let's say, where people joined together. And so the sensation of all in a single community reading the news at breakfast gave a sensation of community. Now, right now, we won't go into what Benedict Anderson and so on and so forth did with that particular phrase and that particular reality. But I'm sure insights from both ends of this news spectrum will come up time and again in our discussions throughout today. Now, a couple of practical things, as I mentioned in the first 2 seconds of our meeting today, we are indeed recording these sessions. So if you don't want to appear, please stop your video. And if you don't want to be heard, mute your mic, and questions can be posed on the chat, which Sarah Mansuti will be moderating throughout these days. You can also raise your hand if you happen to be showing your video. We will attempt to remain very close to schedule in as much as possible, because we have quite a lot of material to cover. And so as a word of advice to our chairs of sessions, in this context, because we don't have the possibility of passing little sheets of paper saying 2 minutes to end of whatever, vocal interruption is courtesy in this context. Okay, so that it's fine for the chair to say, okay, and speakers, please don't take it amiss. It's simply a practical aspect of our keeping the clock from ticking out of control. So again, when you're not speaking, voice and video off as much as possible. I guess video on is okay. The point being, of course, that we want to maintain the integrity of our transmission, and there can be bandwidth problems if everyone has everything on at once. So that is certainly an aspect. So Charis will provide minimal introductions to our speakers. There is more elaboration on the bio page of your program. So don't be surprised if our introductions to each of the speakers seem a little bit clipped. That's also a matter of the time we have available and our interest in being good and courteous to all. So once again, thank you so much for being with us, and we're looking forward to a wonderful and fruitful pair of days. At the end of today, I should say, we have a period for a kind of a roundup. We're calling it Conference Day Conclusion. I think it's on your schedule. And at the end of tomorrow, there will be a round table, which will involve the members of the EURONEWS team and a number of others who have agreed to pitch in. So once again, thank you so much to all. And it turns out that the first panel chair, oh my goodness, I have to set a good example here, I hope. The first panel chair, it turns out, is, well, Brendan Dooley. So here I am as your panel chair, and this first session goes from 9:30 to 11. Let's see if we have all of our panelists. So Mac Mathúna.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. And Máire Nickenborg.
Yes.
Yeah, Máire, good. And Brendan Twomey, I saw, right? I'm keeping an eye on all the Brendans, right? The special eye. And Blaine Hurley, Dr. Bláithín, yeah. Right. So let me indeed then introduce this particular panel, which deals with circulation and reception in a number of very carefully defined contexts. The papers are wide-ranging. This is a characteristic, I'll have to say, of many of these panels, which have been put together sort of ex post facto by our team in order to create variety as well as to create integration. So I think you're going to like the results. Sometimes the results will be a little challenging. That's a feature of the huge variety, the very wide variety of applications that we received. Grateful that we are for that success. So without any further ado, let me introduce Professor Mac Mathúna, who is Professor Emeritus of Irish at UCD. Publications include On the Cultivation of Written Irish in Urban Areas and Douglas Hyde, My American Journey, and along with Máire Nickenborg. And he's the editor of Église, a journal of Irish studies, and I'll stop there, setting a good example. You can read the rest of the bios on the bio page. And Liam will be talking about Taigon or Niactin, a case study in Gaelic media reception in 18th century Dublin. Once again, thank you very much, Professor, for being with us.
Yes, Marie, everyone. Hello, everybody. I'd like to use PowerPoint, so I just want to see if we can share screen.
looking good.
Yeah, no, just I need to move some things at the top of the screen. I need to get to slideshow. Which
The slideshow, Liam, is in the middle of the screen.
yeah, no, but I can't.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll just try again. I can't get to the top. I have two pieces of information coming in. So yeah, I have the toolbars right across, and your screen sharing. Stop share. Can I? I obviously need to hide the top line of hide video. But maybe I'll start anyway, and we'll see. I can.
I think, Liam, if you press on the middle one, slideshow on the, if you see that, and if
I
you
don't.
press,
No, I don't. You see, I see new share and your screen.
oh,
Your
okay,
screen sharing.
okay.
If you click F5 on your keyboard,
Okay. Okay. Just a second.
it will.
Yeah.
will-
Well, okay. I'll try share again on 5. I have tried 5.
Do you mean F5, Sarah?
F5.
Oh, F5. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
It
I still
works.
have some bars at the top. Is that okay for everybody else? Do you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry for that. Now, Dr. Máire Bhaird and I have been collaborating for a number of years on a research project on the life and work of Dr. Douglas Hyde, the leading cultural activist of the language revival. Through force of personality and the relatively favourable temper of his time, Hyde was able to bring his concern for the future of the Irish language and its culture to centre stage in the public sphere at the beginning of the 20th century. On the other hand, 200 years earlier, Taigho Neachtan lived in the shadow of the penal laws, and despite his consuming interest in the Irish language, the circumstances of the period required him to live his life as an observer on the periphery of the public sphere, which was then essentially an Anglo-sphere. Máire and I thought it might be of interest to juxtapose the experiences of O'Neachtan and Hyde as they engaged with the newspapers and news of their day. Sean O'Neachtan and his son Hyde were at the centre of Gaelic scholarship in Dublin in the first half of the 18th century. Originally from County Roscommon, O'Neachtan Sr. seems to have settled in Dublin about 1670, at a time when the city was undergoing rapid growth. While this was especially true with regard to the area north of the River Liffey, it was also the case in relation to the Earl of Meath's Liberty, situated west of the city walls and St. Patrick's Cathedral, the locality where Sean O'Neachtan came to live. Both father and son earned their living as teachers, but were tireless scholars and scribes as well. Responding to the rise of the individual alongside the traditional sense of community of the native Irish Catholics, much of their work is infused by the impulses of modernity and sensibility which permeated the city's intellectual life at the time. The numerous extant manuscripts which the O'Neachtans and their learned colleagues wrote bear testimony to that community's industry, not only in preserving the literature of earlier periods, but in creating new works. Of particular interest is the fact that Hyde compiled 6 commonplace manuscript volumes in which he entered Irish translations and English renderings of items from the Dublin newspapers of the day. He also recorded a number of accounts of contemporary happenings in the city, which he witnessed personally. You can see the list there, 3 of the manuscripts in the National Library, 1 in Trinity, 1 in the Royal Irish Academy, and 1 in King's Inns Library. Dubliners were well served by newspapers in the early 18th century, as our co-panelist Brendan Twomey has summarised their general format as follows. Foreign and British news provide at least 75% of the copy, and Irish news and advertisements usually less than 25%. Core themes of the coverage included political events and celebrations, such as the arrival and departure of the Lord Lieutenant, celebration of the Queen's birthday, and other key Protestant anniversaries. The newspapers also included reports of shipping movements, crime, desertion from the army, items lost, property for sale, and a miscellany of personal advertisements, notices, and weather reports. In all, Tyge O'Nachtan has left us approximately 150 news items. The accounts from newspapers date from 1707 to 1752, extending over more than 4 decades. However, the vast majority belong to the period from 1721 to 1744. Tyge's news items describe events not only in Dublin and the rest of Ireland, but in Britain, Europe, and throughout the world. And they reflect the confluence of his own personal interests and those of the newspaper editors. With regard to subject matter, he tended to focus on the following topics: extreme weather events, natural disasters, European high politics, especially news concerning the Stuarts in exile, and the sectarian and political tensions which were a regular feature of life in Dublin during the early decades of the 18th century. Now, the following are the papers that I drew on, quite a lot as you can see. And in 5 cases, he provides Irish versions of the titles, or at least a description. So we have Lucen T-shirt for Castle Current, Seoirse Faulkner in the Nuacht, Julius Divlin, and then Tilnasach Clia, John Harley in the Nuacht, Thomas Wally, Skinner. As I mentioned, Tyge's first entries are from the year 1707, which coincidentally is the one chosen by Brendan for his book entitled Dublin in 1707. And there is one case of overlap. Robert Bryan, writing in 1726 on the reverse side of the Dublin Gazette of 27 December 1707, mentions a great storm of wind, and the newspaper itself has on Friday and Saturday, as you can see, happened as terrible a storm of wind as has been known for some years past, which has blown down houses, several stacks of chimneys, and done great damage throughout the city and suburb. Focus of Tyge is slightly different. Describes a moonless night, I'm translating now, from 6 until 10. There was a great number of blood-coloured clouds in the sky, and the night was so bright the mountains over the city of Dublin could be seen, which I myself am witness to. Tyge O'Nachtan. Now, the same year, he has 2 entries of wonders reported from England: a great fish seen, and then a lamb born with 1 head but 2 bodies. Further afield, a letter had arrived on the 7th of June, recounting all the damage inflicted by a great storm in Bengal in India. A French ship had been blown aground by the great violence of the wind. But there is a link to the fascination with wondrous creatures. A number of men were let down into the ship in order to retrieve objects from the wreck, but one after another they failed to return. The light was then carried down to the depths of the ship, and they found an alligator, crocodile on Vour, and they shot this animal, and on opening it found the bodies of the 3 men aforementioned. Now, rather than set out a series of news reports from Dublin and work outwards, I thought it might be more interesting to start far away and retrace our steps back to the liberties. And so, taking our cue from the Hollywood film producer, Samuel Goldwyn, who famously said that one should start a movie with an earthquake and work up to a climax, thought we might begin with earthquakes, as Tyge took a keen interest in them. Reviewing them chronologically, we have first of all Palermo in Sicily in September 1726. And Tyge tells us that a really terrible earthquake shook Palermo, the capital of Sicily, destroying 1/3 of the city and burying alive about 5,000 people in a great crater which opened up in the earth. Many English and Sicilian ships were lost in the bay. The earthquake destroyed palaces and killed 15,000 people in neighbouring areas. Then on the 5th of March, 1727, Tyge noted a report from Nevis in the Caribbean regarding an earthquake which had occurred on the island of Martinique in the previous November. It had almost totally destroyed the port of St. Peter, had levelled 1 mountain and split a second one in 2, had destroyed 200 sugar houses and a great number of churches and other buildings and the people within. Now, interestingly, as you can see on the screen, the word Tyge uses for earthquake is not Crit Talún as we would today, but Faun Craha, which is based on Faun, a word for ground, land, and Craha, trembling. Then a great earthquake destroyed half the royal quarter and all the dwellings and the people living there, we are told, with regard to Peking or Beijing, 1728. And there's a lull of 20 years after this cluster of seismic events before Hyde records an earthquake which devastated Lima in South America. There are 3 entries in all regarding this earthquake, which took place in October 1746. And Hyde writes that the city no longer exists, that everything was sucked into the earth at 10:30 at night, the carnage amounting to 15,000 deaths and the destruction of a great variety of buildings. And much nearer to home, we are told that there was an earthquake in County Wicklow, but that's all it's said. No mention is made of damage. That was May 1726. However, more spectacularly in Ireland, there was a case of a moving bog in County Limerick in 1727, which generated much public interest. Hyde writes in translation, while a mehel was cutting turf on a bog 3 miles from Charleville, the bog moved beneath them and did not stop till it rested a mile distant from the place they were on the side of a hill. And strange to relate, it then only moved a few feet every day, and meadows and gardens were hidden and houses knocked down as the bog travelled. This is according to a letter from Seamus Lewis to Owen McCahill in Dublin, and according to a letter from William Burke, solicitor from Coolleen in County Limerick, to Thomas Burke in St. Michael's Lane in Dublin, 7 July 1727. The flying post of the 70th of July of that year includes the interesting detail that both letters were to be seen at the 3 Tons hostelry in Wine Tavern Street. The strange phenomenon of the moving bog attracted sightseers, as we learn from the second letter, which ended with the interesting note, they tell me that there were more people there yesterday than at a fair. And then there's a PS then as well. There are tents built on purpose for to entertain all the spectators which come in great multitudes all around the country to view this strange and wonderful bog. Major events of tabloid quality like great fires and conflagrations also attracted Hyde's attention. Germany in October 1726, there was a great fire in Swabia. At the church there, the free school, the hospital, and 600 other houses were burned down. And in fact, I checked this out in Wikipedia, and it says that it was actually the worst disaster in the history of Bláithín, destroying 80% of all residential houses and almost all public buildings, and making 1,200 families homeless. And then amazingly, it states, the impact of this fire, which lasted 3 days, is still visible today. Hyde was on the case again when St. Petersburg was hit by an even greater calamity the following year in August 1727. He writes, a dreadful fire started in a warehouse storing hemp, flax, oil, pitch and tar, and soon spread to the other warehouses. 130 houses were destroyed and many killed. Then the flames spread to the ships in the harbour, 3 English, 2 Dutch, 2 German, as well as 42 Russian ones. Up to 500 sailors who jumped overboard, hoping to make it to the side of the harbour, were burned to death by the burning oil and pitch which floated on the water. 1731, he has reports on fires in England, and from time to time he had individual occurrences in Ireland. He reported on the plague in Constantinople in August 1726. 7,000 people died every day, he said, and excuse me. The plague was so bad that the dead remained unburied for many days, and the air becomes so foul that the birds fall down dead from flying above the place. And the overall toll was 180,000, we were told, in the following January. In the international geopolitical arena, Neil Buttimer from Cork has undertaken a close study of Hyde's reactions to the largely maritime war of Jenkins' Ear, which broke out between England and Spain in October 1739. Indications of Hyde's own feelings may be gleaned from the fact that he treats of Spanish successes at some length, but has little to say about English ones. As Buttimer puts it, the Irish source concentrates almost exclusively on Spanish seizures of English ships. By Jackson, one might infer that England made no headway in military matters during the hostilities. However, the periodicals convey a different impression. From the beginning of the conflict onwards, they report English successes in detail alongside the type of losses instanced in the Irish document. Coming back to Ireland and religious tensions here, 1727, we have a report from Limerick of a Catholic priest being hanged for marrying a Catholic and a Protestant. extremes to which the authorities went in their efforts to suppress political opposition are described in the account you have on the screen. One of several such where viciously cruel punishment was meted out publicly as spectacle. So Máynooth Nualine was quartered and his entrails were burned in Dublin because he was sending new soldiers overseas to the Pretender and Pagarach, but by this time in exile in Rome. And by the time this poor captive had suffered death, although the day was basking in the sun until then, there fell flashes of lightning together with terrible thunder, which knocked down the smokestack or chimney in a house near Bloody Bridge in Dublin. After that, there came or fell the most awful shower of rains I myself ever saw. The shower fell as if a river should descend in its sieve or colander. So pathetic fallacy comes into play here, as the heavens themselves blazed forth the death of the courageous Jacobite. The opposite happened when news came of the death of King George I, and we are told that the second day, the day afterwards, Hyde, William Ayres and 20 others were out fishing in the sea between Howth and Bullock or Dalkey, killing birds in Dalkey Island. Now, Hyde was interested in infrastructural development, and he records the work beginning on the water reservoir, the water basin beside James's Street near the Liberties, and it is said that it covers 6 acres of ground. So now this became popular and fashionable quite soon, and you can see then that by August 1727, when there was beautiful autumn weather, the people gathered for a night of music, and at that spot, and then other nights, every second night in Stephen's Green. No one was allowed, except they were clothed in black in mourning for King George, and it seemed that, on the other hand, that the inlets and sea harbours were altogether abundantly laden with every kind of fish from the night the report came of the death of George. So he's sort of rubbing it in here. What we have is a fine instance of Hyde's subversive textual messaging. Officialdom is enforcing a show of mourning on Dublin citizenry, but nature knows otherwise and is out of sympathy with the royal bereavement. Fish are abundant. However, I would like to conclude on a more positive note, one of societal collaboration. The nationwide famine which accompanied the Great Frost of 1740-41 prompted cross-community cooperation. O'Nachton's testimony is particularly significant with regard to the bitter weather and subsequent famine of 1741, which many historians feel may have surpassed even that of the 19th century. And translation, he says, hardship caused very many to die throughout all of Ireland, and especially in Munster and Connacht. In Cork alone, 160 people were buried in a single pit. In Connacht, the fever sickness was so dreadful and so common that the houses in which it occurred were shut as in the time of plague. However, treating each news item as a discrete entry in Hyde's manuscripts does not do justice to the complexity of their integration into his narrative. Hyde's news accounts are interwoven with 2 poems of his own composition in Irish. This mingling of poems with prose narrative is characteristic of the Irish tradition. Verse serves as the medium which gives voice to heightened emotion. The last quatrain of the second poem reads, again translation, a hard heart is like frost, and its humanity in coldness of snow, charity never departed any time from the people of noble Ireland. Were it not for the help organised by all, vast numbers of the poor would have starved to death, as the suffering was so great. And Hyde himself had witnessed this charity. As I myself know, who saw the daily charity of Englishmen, or Anglo-Irishmen and Irishmen to the poor of Dublin and the neighbouring districts. For they voluntarily gave gold and silver, meal and coal to nourish the wretched, without inquiring whether Protestant or Papist, but in their turn. And farmers gave permission for bushes and fences to be cut and burned, with charity above all charity. I am Hyde O'Nachton. Now, in many ways, this final quotation sums up Hyde O'Nachton's worldview. He was someone who felt great empathy for others, be they the poor of his own city and country, or those suffering a great calamity far away at the ends of the earth, as it were. And he was capable of rising above the sectarian strife which permeated Irish life and European politics during his lifetime. Above all else, he was a man of the world, a man of the moment, a man fascinated by breaking news, by exciting news. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Liam, for this fascinating tale. And I'm sure there are many comments also about these moving accounts that you've shown us. However, at the moment, I'd like to move the questions and comments to the end of today's, not the end of the day, no, to the end of this panel. So we'll have that will give people a chance to think about what they would like to ask. And in the meantime, thanking you, Liam, I would like to move to our next speaker, who is Dr. Máire on Bhaird, who is a lecturer in Irish language and literature and history of education at Maynooth University. Main research is on the life and work of Douglas Hyde. And she will be speaking about visions in volumes. So thank you once again, Máire, for being with us. Looking forward to hearing.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here now. Can everybody see that? Yeah, great. Okay. Gurmagov. So I'm very lucky to be working with Untitled Mac Mathúna for a number of years on a research project on the life and work of Dr. Douglas Hyde, the leading cultural activist of the language revival. Douglas Hyde was a lifelong generator, collector and recorder of ego documents and ephemera, letters, diaries, drafts of speeches, newspaper cuttings and photographs. For example, there are 13 diaries. There are 13 diaries that Hyde wrote between 1874 and 1912, which are housed in the National Library of Ireland. In this photo, you can see his first diary that he kept between 1874 and 1876. The newspapers provided a platform for the dissemination of nationalist and revivalist ideals, so their importance as an instrument of change shouldn't be overlooked. In the early 1900s, the news reached the public all in print, and the newspapers were at the height of their power and influence. Journalism is important because it can give us a window into the past. It is for this reason that journalism is sometimes called the first draft of history. Hyde, a cultural activist, had an astute appreciation of the importance of publicity and public relations, as did John Quinn, the Irish-American New York lawyer, and Father Peter York, the Irish-born Catholic priest in San Francisco, who were the principal organizers of Hyde's 1905-1906 fundraising tour of America for the Gaelic League. John Quinn was born in Ohio in 1870, the oldest son of Irish immigrants. From an early age, Quinn was fascinated by literature. I became a collector of books, he later wrote, almost as soon as I ceased to be a collector of marbles. Moving to New York, Quinn quickly established himself as an accomplished and affluent lawyer. Quinn became a patron of the arts and a champion of the revival period, and even visited Ireland and spent time in Coole Park, where he met Douglas Hyde for the first time. Douglas Hyde's book, My American Journey, is dedicated to John Quinn, which highlights how Hyde wished to bestow a very high honour on Quinn and to praise him for his work as chief organiser of the tour, which highlights the importance of Quinn to the whole operation. Father Peter York was an Irish-American Catholic priest and a noted Irish Republican and Labour activist in San Francisco. Born in Galway, and he then studied in St. Patrick's College, Maynooth for 4 years before being adopted by the Archdiocese of San Francisco. He was ordained in 1887. In San Francisco, he became the editor of the Monitor, the official newspaper of the Archdiocese. In 1902, he founded and edited a local San Francisco newspaper called The Leader. A short street called Peter York Way in San Francisco is named after him. So there's a picture of Peter York. Douglas Hyde, president of the Gaelic League, left Rattra in County Roscommon, Ireland on the 6th of November 1905, as he and his wife Lucy Comatina Kurtz set off on his lecture trip to America to promote the Gaelic League. Hyde was 46 years of age. He went to the Gresham Hotel on O'Connell Street, then known as Sackville Street. At 7:15 p.m. that evening, a giant torchlit procession planned to bid farewell to Hyde and brought him to Knightsbridge Station, now Euston Station. On the 8th of November, he boarded the SS Majestic in Queenstown, now known as Cove in Cork. Hyde landed on Wednesday, the 15th of November, 1905 in New York. He returned to Ireland on the 24th of June, 1906, with many stories and memories from his trip. His journey spread right across the States from the eastern seaboard to the western. Hyde's 1904-1907 diary has diary entries from the day he left Ratra until the 1st of January 1906. He stops mid-sentence on the 1st of January and doesn't pick up his diary until August 1906. This trip was about fundraising and highlighting the Irish revival. For example, in his diary on the 28th of November 1905, when he is in Hartford, Connecticut, Hyde writes that he went into the big city and asked the wealthy people for money. He was promised $200 from one man. He concludes that day, as he did many a diary entry with reference to the weather, a very wet day. John Quinn organised a very tight schedule for Hyde, as can be seen from this document here, housed in, sorry, it's not there. Anyway, housed in the National Library, Ireland. He had a lot of work to do, but Quinn did look after him, as we can see in the diary entry here from the 29th of November, 1905, where he says that he had a cold and John wouldn't let him out and brought him his dinner to him. NUIG's James Hardiman Library contains a scrapbook of press cuttings of Hyde's American tour, and Dr. Barry Houlihan was very kind to us. He sent us a lot of images for this presentation. From February to June 1906, and this mainly has American newspapers and others dealing with Hyde's triumphant return to Ireland. The Galway volume is a testimony to the international public recognition accorded to Hyde as the pioneering leader of the Gaelic revival and its campaign of cultural disruption. This volume, named Volume 2, was prepared by Una Neogon, a Gaelic League colleague of Hyde's. It is assumed that the first volume is either lost or missing. The National Library of Ireland acquired a similar, if less elaborate, scrapbook for 1903 to 1904, compiled by Hyde himself. It would appear, therefore, that Hyde compiled scrapbooks of his own and of the Gaelic League's activities over the years. Una Neogon was born in 1868. She began collecting religious poems around 1915. In 1928, Dawn Today was published. Una collected the words and the airs and edited the book, and she dedicated this book to Douglas Hyde. He was her inspiration in regard to the Irish language. However, Una died in 1927, therefore it was Hyde who ensured that this collection was published. She was a Protestant nationalist, and images of her wearing the national colours in the clothes she wore have been shared by people who lived in her neighbourhood. Here is an extract from the letter Hyde wrote to Dr. Lawler in 1928 about Una's publication. My dear Dr. Lawler, I'm sending you a translation of the Irish hymns and music that Miss Young collected. When she died a year ago, I took over the work of seeing it through the press, with more trouble than any of my own books ever did. I only wish Miss Young had lived to see her book in print. Yours very truly, Douglas Hyde. Perhaps Una Neogon collated Volume 2 by the way of a gift for Hyde at Christmas, because as you can see here, it's uncreeving even from his friend Una Neogon, Nullig, 1906. This scrapbook is not in chronological order of the American tour, but it is categorized alphabetically. As you can see on this page under the letter C, we have the places that he visited in California. John Quinn worked on increasing Hyde's overall reputation in America. This public relations plan that John Quinn created and implemented was a strategic communication process that helped the success of Hyde's tour. Understanding the target audience is the most important part of any successful public relations strategy, and both John Quinn and Hyde knew their audiences. The publicity that Hyde achieved through newspapers at the time helped to heighten the public awareness of Hyde, Hyde's lecture tour, and of his fundraising mission. This was a highly successful marketing campaign. Publicity through the newspapers helped Hyde to get his story out there, helped others to become aware of him and his organisation. Media played a very significant role in keeping everyone updated about his tour schedule and his successes. The most important function of the media is to disseminate news to the masses concerning vital occurrences or important information, and the newspapers did exactly this, as can be seen through Una's scrapbook, where she kept, for example, newspaper reports, lecture pamphlets, which helped showcase the strategic marketing machine that aided the successful tour of America. The newspapers at the time not only reported on Hyde's lectures, but they also informed the public about when and where they would be held. He was publicised in the Washington Times, the Washington Post, and the Sunday Star on the 20th of May 1906, before his talk that evening. Language such as "one of Ireland's great men to lecture in the city," "leader of his people," "he is regarded as one of the greatest men in Ireland" was used. Large font headlines are used, which would have helped increase publicity, and the use of attention-grabbing headlines is prominent throughout this collection. Throughout this scrapbook, you not only see written text, but you also see sketches of Hyde and photographs too. A picture is a great way to convey your message quickly to an audience without them reading through a lot of text. Printed pictures are incredibly important as they allow us to capture a certain moment in time. The brain absorbs and synthesizes visual information faster than any other stimuli, making visual content an incredibly effective medium. This picture is taken from the News, Toronto, on Friday, the 18th of May, 1906. We see Douglas Hyde, who is standing tall, looking powerful, and his moustache is the most striking physical feature that always enhances his character. The following sentence appears around his figure: "None of the good old Irish songs were forgotten." And the title of the piece is "Dr. Douglas Hyde, a Distinguished Irish Orator." We see Hyde's non-partisan attitude which he publicly held, and which allowed him to be a very suitable statesman as Ireland's first president in this piece about his speech in Massey Hall, Toronto. Irish Orator sings the praises of the Emerald Isle. The Gaelic League is a dove of peace, presenting neither clique, faction nor party. Here we see the pamphlet that was used during his lecture in Washington in May 1906. This was not unusual. Most of his lectures had a pamphlet with the order and schedule for the event. Hyde spoke in the National Theatre in Washington, D.C. on Sunday evening, May 20th, 1906. The Star-Spangled Banner was sung, and also God Save Ireland, which was an Irish rebel song, and it served as the unofficial Irish national anthem for Irish nationalists during this period. Again, another example from Una's collection is the event which happened 1 week later in the theatre on Sunday evening in Bridgeport, Connecticut on May the 27th, 1906. Hyde looks nearly regal in nature in this photo. Here we have a piece in the publication The Tidings, which was founded in 1895 and is the oldest continuously published Catholic periodical on the west coast of the United States. Even the title here, "Prepare for the Coming of Dr. Hyde," has biblical connotations. It makes you want to read more about the man in the photo, who looks very important, and the light shining on his face illuminates him and highlights to the reader his importance and the vast knowledge that he holds and will share at this meeting in Los Angeles on March the 12th, 1906. He stayed in Hotel Alexandria, which was constructed as a luxury hotel at the beginning of the 20th century. This piece shows the detail, planning, and depth of work needed for Hyde's visits, and also continues to urge those who wish to get their tickets to do so. The Dr. Hyde Executive Committee has been doing quiet but effective work within the past 2 weeks, and arrangements are now almost completed for the reception to the distinguished Irish leader. Those who wish to secure seats for the mass meeting on the 12th of March are urgently advised by the Executive Committee to procure their seats at once, as the committee expects that the demand will exceed supply. Here we see the Irish World, an American industrial liberation newspaper. Patrick Ford settled in New York in 1870 and founded the Irish World, which became the principal newspaper of Irish America. We see Douglas Hyde presented as a man of strength, a leader who oozes charisma. He is pictured in various standing positions when narrating during his tour. This was published on 10th of March, and during this period he would have been in California. Even the use of the words addressing great audiences in California highlights the impact of his tour and the eagerness of newspapers to help the propaganda machine in order to raise funds for an Irish Ireland. Surrounding the figures of Hyde in this newspaper are words from his speeches, such as, "The greatest misfortune that ever befell Ireland was the loss of his language. I'm here to explain to you the life and death struggle upon which we are now engaged in Ireland." Hyde regularly used the term life and death struggle when presenting, and this wording would encourage people to give generously. He was a clever orator and chose his words carefully to ensure an emotive response from the audience and also to ensure drama in the newspapers. This is an example of the speech Hyde gave to the crowds when in Chicago. He used emotive language, and the imagery of this life and death struggle can be seen again. His natural acting abilities helped him in his endeavour to move the masses towards the Irish League and to promote its importance. This speech is found in the National Library. I am not exaggerating when I say that I look upon the moral support of the Irish in America to be the most valuable asset that the Gaelic League at home could have. I'm here today to explain to you the life and death struggle upon which we are engaged in Ireland. I see that the papers say that this is the last grand struggle of the Irish race to preserve their language. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, it is 10 times, it is 100 times, it is 1,000 times more far-reaching than that. It is the last possible life and death struggle of the Irish race to preserve not their own language, but their national identity. The poem on this slide was delivered to Hyde during Hyde's lecture to hundreds in Oakland on March the 1st, 1906. There was a lot of thought and effort put into the welcoming of Hyde, from songs and also poetry written about Hyde himself. For example, "Welcome to Dr. Douglas Hyde, you bring glad news from our old Ireland, news to cheer the exiled souls, you bring glad news from Holy Ireland, where green hills rise and clear streams roll, you come to preach that land and nation, land the fairest ever sung, you come to preach the restoration of our grand old Gaelic Celtic tongue." In the San Francisco Call newspaper, the following was written on the 2nd of March 1906 about Hyde's Oakland lecture, that by his own unaided efforts, Hyde had done more to bring together and nationalise the Irish people than any other man of his generation. Hyde was introduced as the ambassador of Irish Ireland, and he was escorted to the city by Reverend York, and he also introduced Hyde to the crowd in Oakland. In the San Francisco Examiner on March the 3rd, 1906, the following describes his lecture. "The Tivoli Opera House was crowded to its utmost capacity yesterday afternoon, with boys and girls from the city's public schools and their teachers all eager to hear the famous Gaelic educator, Dr. Douglas Hyde. Folklore is in danger of extinction. It is the unwritten literature, so easily lost." Hyde understood the importance of preserving our literature, and it is noteworthy that he delivers this speech to children in San Francisco in the Tivoli Theatre, as the school children of Ireland helped preserve Irish folklore in the 1930s when they participated in the school scheme. This newspaper, the San Francisco Examiner, is a newspaper distributed in and around San Francisco and published since 1863. It is poignant that the San Francisco Examiner highlighted Douglas Hyde's tour of San Francisco, because after the great earthquake and fire, the offices were destroyed on April 18th, 1906. The big earthquake, which hit on April 18th, 1906, destroyed San Francisco. Hyde and Lucy had left San Francisco on the 26th of March after spending nearly 6 weeks there. High intensity shaking, devastating fires soon broke out in the city and lasted for several days. Thousands of homes were dismantled, 3,000 people died, 80% of the city was destroyed. The events are remembered as one of the worst and deadliest earthquakes in the history of the United States. Hyde wrote himself in My American Journey, "When it was getting dark and I was on the train, I read a notice in the paper that San Francisco was on fire. The story scared me. I waited impatiently until I heard more. It hit my core when I thought about the local people and the great friends I'd left behind there." When Leo Varadkar visited San Francisco on his first official visit as Irish Taoiseach in 2017, he gave the following speech at City Hall, San Francisco. In 1906, the founder of the Gaelic League and our future president, Douglas Hyde, visited San Francisco and captured the city's heart. The story of his visit made the front page of the San Francisco Examiner, and it was noted that all of San Francisco seemed to want to embrace him. He raised significant funds in support of Irish culture and Irish language. However, a couple of months later, when the devastating earthquake hit this city, he returned all the money and donated it to crisis relief. It was an act which showed the genuine bond of affection between our people. Hyde found in San Francisco a strong and vibrant Irish community. Hyde's understanding of keeping memories, documenting personal data, collecting folklore, the importance of posterity and social historical documents is seen in his eagerness to keep accurate accounts of his life. When Hyde was in America, he had postcards to share his adventures with his friends and children. They were in a way seeing what had been in front of their parents' eyes. Postcards weren't expensive and they helped Hyde keep in contact with his girls when away. Here we have a few postcards which Hyde and Lucy sent home. Both showed the destruction caused by the earthquake. For example, Lucy's message to Una on her postcard, this one here you can see in front of you, must have been very hard for her to read and then to share with her sister Nuala. The recent earthquake and fire have swallowed up these 5 idols. We just escaped in time. You never would have seen us again if we had remained on. Everything was burnt up. Our grand hotel and all Chinese town, all burnt, and lots of Chinese too. Save all postcards, all very valuable now, LH. And here's another one. You can see the pictures here of the devastation after the earthquake. Here we see an example of Hyde communicating directly with the press and publicity and publicly thanking them for sharing his story and sharing his American mission with the people. Tháinig mé an bhur measc mar cheachtar ó Éireann, le hinsin díobh cadtóir siúla gcuin an Éireann, agus mar tá an Gaeilge dul an uachtar agus an Gaeilge dul an éachtar in Éireann inniu. Tá mé buíocht díobh go léir agus do fápéirbh na tíre seo ile agus go bhór mór de Telegram an Tráthnóna, son có topics có géireann san uachtain síos mo scéal. Bannacht é uirmh mise an Críomhín. Here we once again see the need for the media to advertise events. Famous Irishman to be guest of honour at Recreation Park this afternoon at 2 o'clock. The admission fee will be 25 cents. There will be hurling and football. And then in another extract, we see about how the event was very successful. This was a common thread stitching all the newspaper articles in this volume together. Again, Reverend York introduces Hyde here when speaking at Berkeley University on the history of folktales on March the 2nd, 1906. And he also has a key role to play in the big banquet in the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. Here we have an example of a Gaelic poem written by William G. Egan, which was presented to Hyde before his departure from San Francisco. And again, the adjectives used describe Hyde as very mannerly, as majestic. For the week that is in it, I had to show you the Douglas Hyde edition of the San Francisco Leader that Una collected for her scrapbook. This newspaper was founded by Father York in 1902, and it was the March 17th edition, 1906, that you can see here. So you see on the front page, you see Douglas Hyde, you see Lucy Hyde, his wife, Glenda Locke, and Frank J. Sullivan. We see here a discussion also about the banquet given to Hyde in the Palace Hotel on March 21st, 1906. The banquet given to Dr. Douglas Hyde at the Palace Hotel was the most brilliant social gathering ever held in San Francisco. Never did San Francisco give a heartier greeting to an honoured visitor than was extended to Dr. Douglas Hyde at the Tivoli Theatre on Sunday, February the 18th. Thousands attended the reception despite the stormy nature of the day, and what an enthusiastic gathering it was. Frank J. Sullivan was the chairman, and we can see his admiration for Hyde in his letter. There are numerous letters held in the National Library, and they show the positive response and nearly celebrity status that befell on Hyde during his tour. My dear friend, I'd hoped to meet you once more before you sailed for home, but circumstances did not permit my leaving the city. Since we met, I have followed closely every line published about your great success in this broad, big-hearted country, and rest assured that the greater your success, the more joy it gave me. Dr. Douglas Hyde has returned from his triumphant tour of the United States. On Saturday night, he will preside at the great mass meeting in the Grand Central Palace, which has been called by the Irish volunteers to aid the fund for the San Francisco sufferers. Dr. Hyde left San Francisco some 2 weeks before the earthquake. Perhaps no man in his day and generation had received a more generous and courteous reception than Dr. Hyde received on the Pacific coast. He was charmed with the people, with the type of Irishmen he met there. The titles here are powerful. Dr. Douglas Hyde, the foremost Celt now living, will preside. Big Irish meeting to aid San Francisco. They would pull at anyone's heartstrings. Dr. Hyde knew that Father York was doing a giant's work in caring for the many poor and helped persons who had left San Francisco and had gone to Oakland. He said that whatever he could contribute out of the Gaelic money raised in this country should be sent to Father York. He felt he was doing the best for the needy by giving it to the hands of this good priest, the $5,000, which he had once determined to send them. The $5,000 which he has given to the San Francisco Fund represents literally the work of his own hands and the sweat of his brow. To use the doctor's own impressive words, "My heart has been broken and the great pleasure of any visit to this country has been spoiled by the appalling calamity that has overtaken the people of San Francisco. And my first thought was to give what I felt I could to the relief of their suffering. My second thought was to arrange the telegraphing of the money. It went on Monday by telegraph, as you can see there on the slide. If one was to be cynical, one could say that this was an extremely clever publicity stunt to ensure that the newspapers knew that Hyde was giving his money back to San Francisco. However, from reading personal diaries, it is certain that this natural disaster had a profound effect on Hyde and that he felt very close to the people of San Francisco and very much loved by them. The Irish Independent on the 25th of June 1906 shows the arrival of Dr. Douglas Hyde at Kingsbridge Station yesterday evening. Filla an Chríomhainn is the title. The hats are raised, Hyde's moustache makes him stand out from the crowd. There are no women to be seen, and Hyde is taller and dominant. It is a scene of success and jubilation. Even the language used to describe the American tour has spiritual connotations. Here you can see it described as an Chríomhain's mission. He is the saviour. The tour itself was publicised as a huge success in papers in Ireland and abroad. Hyde was described as a hero. He was indeed an idol and a superstar upon his return, and it was the media, the newspapers, that helped ensure a celebrity status befell on Hyde. Here's Douglas Hyde on the front of the San Francisco newspaper coverage. Impact is twofold when we consider the media coverage of Hyde's visits. Firstly, those who turned out to hear him speak, and secondly, those who read newspaper reports on the speeches. This made it available not just to the Irish in the local area, but also in the newspapers back home. It impacted and inspired revivalists back in Ireland. His dramatic personality and ease in speech making made him a force to be reckoned with when on his tour of America in 1905-1906. Hyde raised more than $64,000 for the Gaelic League, starting off in Boston and finishing up in New York. Hyde's American adventure helped prepare him for his academic career as the first professor of modern Irish in UCD and also as first president of Ireland. Hyde's ability and skill of understanding his audience and adapting accordingly, abstaining from controversy, dealing with the press, and rousing audiences with the speech delivery was honed during this trip. Hyde's American adventure was the beginning of a new stage in Hyde's public role in Irish affairs. Gurmila Magov.
And thank you so much, Máire Nicon Bhaird, for this fascinating evocation of a particular case of impact. And we will definitely be coming back to some of the themes, the questions that you raised towards the end of this particular session. So once again, a virtual applause from our participants. And we now move on to the next paper on this panel by Dr. Brendan Twomey, who's an independent scholar, finished his PhD at TCD, and is interested in early 18th century studies and practice publishes concerning financial matters in that period. And today he'll be talking about Jonathan Swift, actually Swift's political pamphlets, Medium, Message, and Impact. So thank you very much, Brendan, for being with us, and the podium is yours.
Can you hear me now?
Can indeed.
Yeah. And am I sharing screen adequately? Can you see my messages there?
You are. Yes,
now.
you should have
there.
a very
Yeah, there we
excellent.
go.
Perfect.
Okay, so thank you very much. And picking up indeed from the very end of the last talk in terms of impact and superstar, Swift has to be one of the big superstars. So in the autumn of 1729, Marmaduke Coghill, MP and Revenue Commissioner, wrote to a fellow government bureaucrat in London, "I have herewith sent you a paper which we think to be Swift's, in which you see the genius and spirit of the man with his usual indiscretion." Coghill was referring to Swift's modest proposal. So moving on, modest proposal. Or to give it its full title, A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of the Poor from Becoming a Burden to their Parents or Country and Making them Beneficial to the Public. This very modest pamphlet, just 16 pages, 2 sheets of paper, and a total of 3,420 words, is still shocking, even in the 21st century, as you can see here from images from a recent reproduction of it. And those of you who know Dublin will recognize that these pictures are the inside of Swift's deanery in Kevin Street. So the images are being very, very powerful. A year earlier, in 1728, Coghill had noted, "Swift has published a paper today which I am very sorry for it, being to keep up faction and making that division amongst us that must do us mischief. But the happiness of this country must subsist by the good agreement and harmony amongst us all, whether English or Irish Protestants." On this occasion, Coghill was referring to a piece by Swift in his short-lived weekly journal called The Intelligencer, where Swift had decried the dreadful state of the Irish economy, then entering its 3rd year of near-famine conditions. As we can see, Swift's messaging did not meet with universal approval by his contemporaries. And as ever in this period, Swift traced the source of Ireland's dire situation back to his usual list of suspects: English constitutional and commercial tyranny, absentee landlords remitting rents to England, the appointment of Englishmen to all the plum jobs in Ireland, causing a further drain on Irish limited resources, and cupidity and feeble response on the part of the Irish leadership in responding to these challenges. 3 years earlier, in 1725, Swift had written to his friend Alexander Pope in London the famous lines, well, at least famous to those of us who dabble in Swiftiana all the time. "The chief end I propose to myself in all my labors is to vex the world rather than divert it." He continued, and as an aside, it's always worth in Swift studies to read the sentence before and the sentence after the one you quote. It can often make a big difference. He continued, "And if I could encompass that design without hurting my own person or fortune, I would be the most indefatigable writer you have ever seen." And is vexing the world his real motivation? And why this reticence about his person and his future, or his fortune, one wonders? In 1725, Swift was basking in the glory of his leadership role in the Woods Halfpence controversy, where he had led, or at least been part of the leadership of the Irish political nation, and in particular in the 4th Draper's letter, which is dedicated to the whole people of Ireland. But again, what do we mean by the whole people of Ireland in some sort of Andersonian method? The success of Woods Halfpence's campaign and apologies for the poor image was such that George Faulkner, soon to be Swift's primary printer in Dublin, and over the next decade in creating what I have called Brand Swift, issued the collected letters in a volume under the wonderfully pompous title of The Hibernian Patriot. Again, echoes perhaps of some of the points that we've just heard about Douglas Hyde. And of course, Swift loved this. I mean, human pride was one of his great targets, as we'll come on to in a moment. He was a very proud man and he loved the publicity. Finally, in this opening exposition of some of his political pamphlets, and going back a further 5 years, to the spring of 1720, when Swift issued his historically important, but again, physically very modest pamphlet of 14 pages, again, this time running to a mere 3,200 words, a proposal for the universal use of Irish manufacture in clothes and furniture of houses, etc., utterly rejecting and renouncing everything that is wearable that comes from England. To give this, if I can mix it in my metaphors, incendiary text, its full title. It is a truly ephemeral piece. Now, In 1720, Swift was 53 years old, and this pamphlet was his first intervention in Irish politics since his permanent return to Ireland, exile as he would call it, 6 years earlier in 1714, when he had promised himself never to interfere in Irish politics. Clearly, he didn't live up to that promise. But within this pamphlet, we find the famous and still quoted dictum that Ireland would never be happy till a law were made for burning everything that came from England except their people and their coals. And what is not often quoted is, of course, the next sentence, nor am I yet even for the lessening the number of these exceptions. No wonder it caused a serious stir. Now, even for non-Swiftians in the audience, much of this is well known. In the Irish nationalist imagination, the Hibernian patriot dean is the author of a set of almost sacred texts on the political, cultural, and national rights of the Irish nation in opposition to English overlordship. And one common denominator of these is Swift's use of cheap, ephemeral political pamphlets, if you will allow me the stretch of a newspaper article as being a pamphlet, as his weapon of choice to articulate his message to reach his target audience and to succeed in achieving his objectives, albeit despite the quibble of a few government functionaries. QED. I could rest my case. So it seems that Swift's reputation as a political journalist and pamphleteer of the first order is well deserved. And this is to some extent what some Swift scholars have called the soft school of Swift studies. But who was this Swift of whom we speak? Who was he really speaking for? What was his message? What were his methods? And did his interventions really make a difference? There is a harder school of Swift studies that reminds us that Swift's Irish pamphlets were framed by an unrealistically narrow conception of Ireland's constitutional position. He advocated tirelessly for the minority sectarian church against all comers, both Catholic and especially against the Scotch Presbyterians, as he called them. He espoused a neo-authoritarian and landowning gentry aristocratic polity in church and state, and yet he was not a landowner himself. His works are replete with anti-Irish rhetoric. The Draper effectively said that when we want the papist's opinion, we'll give it to them, and so on. So there is another school of Swift thought that we should never lose sight of. Swift knew his world. For example, his first published item, going back to the 1690s, was a poem in praise of King William and the victory at the Battle of the Boyne and how it had saved Protestantism in Ireland. Even more, I think, importantly, it is certainly not the case that Swift was unaware of the land transfers, euphemism for confiscations, that had occurred in the 17th century Ireland. The landed estates and the country houses where he spent a great deal of time in the 1720s and 1730s, Wood Park, County Meath, Galstown and Westmeath, Market Hill and Armagh, had been confiscated in the 17th century, as was the land that was security for the loans that he made, including, actually, I just listening to the previous speaker, Rathra in Roscommon, Rathra Beg in Roscommon. Claude Rawson, the self-proclaimed hard reader of Swift, has castigated the tendency for modern critics to want their author to confirm what he calls to conform to current notions of political virtue resembling a liberal campus chaplain. Rawson regards these soft readings as anachronistic and sanitizing. And he famously commented, and this one you have to double think about it for a moment, in respect of some of Swift's most outrageous comments. We know that he doesn't mean it, but we can't be sure that he doesn't not mean it either. Moving on. Swift had cut his political teeth in terms of the authoring of pamphlets when he was in London in the period 1710 to 1714, when he was effectively the chief of propaganda for the Tory ministry, whose aim was to end the War of Spanish Succession. In London, Swift was close to the centre of power, quite close, although not as close as he liked sometimes to think. He had the inside track, and he loved every minute of it. In these years, he produced 15 major pamphlets and a raft of shorter journalism under the nom de plume of Mr. Examiner to attack the Whig opposition and to bolster the morale of the Tory supporters. And these pamphlets had made a difference. The high point came relatively early with the publication of a 100-page pamphlet entitled The Conduct of the Allies, which went through several editions and sold an unprecedented, or was given away, an unprecedented 10,000 copies within a matter of weeks. But this was Swift operating with a fair wind, with financial resources, and with competent printers. And this was a high watermark for him, where he had shown himself to be a leading practitioner in the use of highly charged, polemical, acerbic, exaggerated political pamphlets, either to reinforce the position or to change the minds and to effect real change. However, when we consider Swift's Irish political pamphlets, which I've discussed earlier, we need to look separately, very separately, at the Dublin pamphlets from these earlier London examples. The Ireland of the 1720s was a very different place from London of a decade earlier. Not only was Swift not on the inside, he was decidedly of the wrong political view. His letters were being opened by the post office, and he was treated more as a member like the way members of the Communist Party were treated in the US in the 1950s. You can't be loyal to the state if you hold those views. His every move was reported to the authorities. As implied earlier, however, Swift's foray into Irish politics indeed did have some impact, if not entirely smooth start. The printer of the Irish Manufacturer and the Draper's Letters later were arrested and imprisoned for seditious libel, although due to popular opposition and some behind-the-scenes manoeuvring by Swift using some of his still available but decreasing political capital, they were not convicted. There was a price on his head of £300, an enormous sum of money in this period, but nobody came forward to claim it. Physically, his Dublin political outputs were very ephemeral objects when compared to the higher quality of London. It is also critically important to note at this point that with the exception of Gulliver's Travels, for which he was paid the significant sum of £200, and some modest income that was earned for him by Alexander Pope on their joint productions in the late 20s and 1730s, all his other output he was not paid for, even including the work in London. And when the possibility of him being paid £50, which he needed, by the way, he was not a rich man until he became the Dean of St. Patrick's in 1713, he knew that accepting that would reduce his independence, and therefore he refused it. So why did Swift invest so much time and energy in writing over 100 pamphlets in what are now seen as occasional pamphlets? Swift does not write grand treatises. All of his pamphlets deal with particular issues and events. I think two motivations suggest themselves. Firstly, Swift was a writer. That's what he did. He had the itch. Writing was his métier. He was good at it. He knew that too. He fully understood how to work with the various genres in which he excelled, including elegies, fake treatises, pamphlets, poetry, books, history writing, journalism, letter, sermons. He dabbles in nearly all the genres. And secondly, he felt he had something to say, but as I outlined earlier, that something was quite a conservative message, which sometimes people find difficulty in accepting in today's world. Orwell, an admirer and fellow exemplar in the art of the political essay, the successor to the political pamphlet of the 18th century, found Swift very hard to take at times, despite his admiration for Swift. And in addition, there were in addition to the bête noire list that I gave earlier, Swift had two other targets. Firstly, human pride. Not surprisingly, a view derived from his profession. Don't forget, the day job was a cleric of the Church of Ireland. He was 50 years as a clergyman. And secondly, bad, AKA modern writing. Bad writing was an affront to Swift. He was personally upset by bad writing. And so, for example, these two things come together in the character of the hack. The kind of paid for gun for hire author of the early period of the early 18th century. Earlier in 1704, in A Tale of a Tub, Swift had written of the modern hack, personizing the modern hack. I am now trying an experiment very frequent among modern authors, which is to write upon nothing. And he continued, when the subject is utterly exhausted, to let the pen still move on by some call the ghost of wit, delighted to walk after the death of its body. Gives you some sense of his hatred of the political hack. And that's why he wasn't taking the money for his own work. He was doing it out of conviction. But again, like all Swift quotations, we need to be very careful. Firstly, Swift never put his name to anything. Slight exaggeration. He put his name to only 2 out of the 100 pamphlets that he wrote. And both of them are authoritarian pamphlets. One is for the preservation of the English language in 1712, where he wanted to become the director of an institute to preserve the language, a bit like the French Academy. And the last pamphlet he ever published in 1737 was for giving badges to the poor of the parishes of Dublin. And he put his name to it. All the other 100 pamphlets are unnamed. They are personas, the Drapier, Bickerstaff, the Injured Lady, etc., etc., ventriloquized throughout. So moving towards 2 conclusions. Firstly, what about impact? Firstly, we must remember that from about 1711 on, Swift was famous, very famous, a fame that was capped, of course, by Gulliver's Travels. In the 1720s, Swift's torrent of words made him an ever-present figure in the Irish public sphere, to a point where his birthday, his illness, his recovery from illness, his return from Dublin to Dublin, his walks in the country were news items, picking up our first speaker about. It'd be interesting to see if O'Nachtan reports on Swift's activities, because Swift is reported in a very unique way in the Irish press in this time, particularly by George Faulkner, who of course has a vested interest. He is creating brand Swift so that he can publish Swift's collected works in the mid-1730s and make a very sizable amount of money out of this. But what I wanted to do, and here is how Swift is memorialized by Faulkner. You don't even put his name on the front of the publication. J.S. DDD SPD, Jonathan Swift, Doctor of Divinity, Dean of St. Patrick's, Dublin. And it is so funny to go through the newspapers of this period. Those initials stick out a mile. It's very easy to find all the references to Swift because it's just JSDDD SPD. It's a branding, a magnificent, tremendous piece of branding. But just the final piece before conclusions is, if we look at the campaigns that he engages in Ireland in the 1720s and the 1730s, and this isn't them all, but if you look at that list, you can see he has a bit of a mixed record when it comes to success and failure. Plus, you will see that many of the topics that he's dealing with are, as I said, occasional. Dublin Corporation and the elections of Dublin MPs. The tithe of ageisment. I purposely put that one up. Only nerds like me know what the tithe of ageisment is about. Nobody reads that pamphlet anymore. We only read the 3 big ones: manufacturers, drapers, and of course, the modest proposal. So, some conclusions. The historiography of the 18th century, especially that of the literary critical variety, has tended to privilege the great Augustan Tory satirists, Pope, Gay, Arbuthnot, and Swift. In doing so, they also privileged the role of print, including the political pamphlet, and also poetry and the images of Hogarth. The appeal of the Augustans is twofold. Firstly, the quality of the writing. And for their enemies, that was a real problem. Why does the devil have all the good tunes was kind of their attitude. But secondly, it is the universal themes addressed in the major masterpieces: Gulliver, the Dunciad, and the Beggar's Opera. Like Animal Farm in 1984, they transcend their immediate context, yet they were written for an immediate context, which is a wonderful thing to pull off as a writer. Of course, they become even richer when the reader is aware of the detail, but you don't have to know all the contemporary detail to understand Gulliver's Travels. And Swift had learned this lesson the hard way. For example, one of his earlier works, A Discourse on the Contents and Dissensions between the Nobles and Commons in Athens and Rome, from 1701, is unintelligible to the modern reader without the notes, because it is totally by allusion, and if you don't know the allusions, it is meaningless. A recent edition of a 44-page text needed 234 pages of notes to make it intelligible to the modern reader. And lastly, we must acknowledge that the pamphlets written by Swift, successful in all as they were not written in a personal vacuum. In my humble opinion, we need to at least know something of the biography of the author, their wealth, physical and mental education, well-being, education, loves, losses, etc. The text is not all there is. How could we understand Pope, for example, if we did not know that he was an outsider, a Catholic in a Protestant world? In the case of Swift, for example, he was always very concerned about money, yet he refuses the £50. He was only a wealthy man, as I've said, after 1713. So even the master, the best stylist, has to trim the message in order to catch the wind. And even for him, the quality of the oeuvre and the impact varied. But as we know, the best were enduring classics, not just of a political pamphlet genre, but they've become permanent literary gifts to the world. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Brendan, and a virtual applause for this marvelous evocation of a complex propagandist. And we again reserve comments and questions to the end and move on now to our final speaker in this panel, Dr. Blaine Hurley, who got her degree from Cambridge in 2016, MA from Warwick in 2009, and BA from the University College Cork in 2008. She's working on the local history collection in the Central Library in Waterford City and lectures up there on the history of art. So thank you very much. And she will be speaking, well, there it is. Murder, He Wrote, the news as reported by James Ryan in his diary. So the podium is yours.
Thank you, Brendan. I hope everybody can hear me and can see everything. When we were talking about COVID earlier and some of the changes that it has made to us, and I suppose the advantages of it, if you can call them that, if it wasn't for COVID, I probably wouldn't have come across the topic of my paper today, because I had only been working at that stage in the local studies in library in Waterford for about 4 months, and I hadn't yet had a chance to go through most of the collection. And when we closed to the public on the 12th of March last year, it gave me that opportunity, and I came across, as I said, the topic of my paper today. So to get started, a little over 100 years ago, the Centre received a donation from Miss Power of Newtown House, Tramore, County Waterford. This donation was of a manuscript which had come into Miss Power's possession through her grandfather, and she felt the library a more fitting place for the work to be held than her private residence. And the Central Library in Waterford City is where that manuscript still remains. Known as the Carrickman's Diary, the work was written by James Ryan, a resident of Carrick-on-Suir on the Waterford-Tipperary border between 1787 and 1809. Ryan was a land surveyor who, at his death, bequeathed the volume to his lifelong friend, William Hayes. As Hayes didn't reside in Carrick-on-Suir, he was unable to carry out Ryan's wish that the entries should continue to be made to record events in and affecting that town. Accordingly, Hayes handed the volume to Francis Doyle, a mutual friend of his and Ryan, with the proviso that if Hayes should return to live in Carrick-on-Suir, then Doyle was to hand it back to him again. At his death, Francis Doyle bequeathed the diary to his nephew, Patrick Hayden, which indicates that William Hayes never returned to live in Carrick-on-Suir. Patrick Hayden was the grandfather of Miss Power. She who donated the manuscript to the library. We can see here notes written by Ryan and Hayes, which explain the transfer of the diary into and out of Hayes' hands. There is also a reference made to Ryan's will and another book, which is described as a memorandum or commonplace book, but this is now sadly lost. During slightly over 20 years, James Ryan recorded a series of events that he believed worthy of inclusion in his diary, which, strictly speaking, is not a diary in the traditional sense. The events he recorded were a mixed bag of social, political, municipal, and ecclesiastical happenings, which together provide an unprecedented view of life in Ireland at the end of the 18th century. The diary consists of 265 written folio pages, exclusive of 200 blank pages. It is bound in vellum, measures 30 centimetres by 18 centimetres, and is inscribed on the cover, James Ryan, 1787, to William Hayes, 1809. Ryan's arrangements of his notes is somewhat peculiar, lending further weight to the notion that this is not a traditional diary. Ignoring the usual journal order, he adopts a method of record by subject, and so we have the headings accidents, deaths, phenomenon, and so on. And interspersed throughout the diary are occasional recipes, calculations, and medical ailment cures. Unsurprisingly for someone who relied very heavily on his writing implements, Ryan also includes instructions on how to prepare quills and inks. And occasionally, he makes a note or observation in Irish. The example I've chosen here relates the tale of young Stephen Flavin, who was arrested for his role in helping his brother Michael run away with Miss Hackett. Stephen managed to escape from jail, and Ryan entered his entry with Slán Lath a Buachail, or Goodbye Boy, which he writes in a good scribal hand, but in a script and spelling which would not be familiar to the modern Irish language scholar. But for scholars of 18th century Ireland, Ryan's account of events is an invaluable resource. All of his entries are written in his own inimitable style, and through his unique combination of compassion and melodrama, we learn of events which we might not otherwise be aware of. More importantly, sometimes these seeming inconsequential events tell us more about Carrickman, Ireland, and Irish life in the 18th century than the first reading suggests. For instance, when writing under the heading of accidents, Ryan states that on the 15th of November, 1787, one of Cornelius Ryan's boats was wrecked against the bridge. The old bridge, of course, he states in brackets. And out of her crew of 7 hands, 3 were unfortunately drowned. Thomas Woods, John Ryan, and Martin Quinn being the names of those who sadly lost their lives. John Ryan's body, we are told, was found at Clonmore, and Thomas Ryan's at Mount Bolton, which are about 20 kilometres downstream from Carrickman. He completes his entry on this tragic event with the poignant note that poor Woods, when found, was still wearing his hat and wig, a reminder of men's fashion at that time. What is interesting about this seemingly average entry is that it actually contains more information than at first meets the eye. We learn, for instance, that Cornelius Ryan had a business of several boats, and the one which was lost must have been substantial enough in size, given that it had a crew of 7 hands. This piece of information serves to remind us that in the 18th century, despite its size, Carrickman was a busy port on the River Suir, and many boats operated out of it. We also learn that the bridge against which this boat was wrecked was one known as the Old Bridge. To this day, Carrickman has a bridge which is called the Old Bridge. This bridge was built in 1447, although the structure we see today was strengthened in the 1920s. What is notable, however, is that this was the first bridge above the estuary of the Suir and was of strategic importance as a link between South Leinster and East Munster. And we can see there a map which shows the early turnpike routes in Ireland, and the little red mark in the middle there is Carrickman, right in the centre of a main route. The city of Waterford downstream had no bridge until the 1790s, and any traffic that wanted to make its way from Dublin to Waterford or from Dublin to Cork, three of Ireland's main cities, found that the only way in which they could do this was by travelling through Carrick-on-Shore. This further meant that the town was on the direct route for news from the capital city, and by extension, its population learnt of this news both national and international, often before those living in Cork or Waterford could. As one who had a voracious appetite for news, local, national and international, we can appreciate Ryan's excitement at the appointment of a new postmaster in Carrick-on-Shore in 1788. He makes the comment, "Bad enough it has been kept for some time past," which relates to how badly served Carrick-on-Shore had been for mail deliveries. In 1789, the year following the postmaster's appointment, to Ryan's relief, a new post route was opened, which brought mail directly to Carrick-on-Shore from Dublin. Prior to this, Carrick-on-Shore's mail was often redirected to the larger town of Clonmel first. 1789 was, all told, a momentous year for travel and communication, especially for those living in Carrick-on-Shore. The 17th of August saw the inauguration of two passenger mail coaches, one from Waterford to Clonmel and the second from Kilkenny to Waterford, both of which passed through Carrick-on-Shore. On the maiden trip of the Waterford to Clonmel service, Ryan tells us that the coach carried 4 passengers, 2 outside and 2 inside. The same year, the diarist writes of the establishment of a mail packet service between Milford Haven in Wales and Waterford City. This meant that mail, newspapers and subsequently news from abroad arrived in Carrick-on-Shore sooner than it ever had previously. To quote Ryan on the new service, "This business is expected to be of great use and advantage to Waterford and its neighbours." But it's not just news and gossip that made it to Carrick-on-Shore ahead of Waterford or Cork. Travelling players who, when journeying from Dublin to these two cities, often stopped off in Carrick-on-Shore on the way, and while there they entertained the townsfolk with plays, concerts and acrobatics. Players, Ryan tells us, came to town in October 1788, having some days earlier played in Dublin. In Carrick-on-Shore, we are told, they played to great houses. The regular access to plays put on by travelling players ensured that the local actors became fully aware of the kind of dramatic fare which attracted an audience. And, not to be outdone by these outsiders, on the 20th of April 1790, Ryan writes that the young gentlemen of Mrs. Dineen's Carrick Academy performed the Siege of Damascus to a full house and great applause. The Siege of Damascus was written in 1720 by the British playwright John Hughes and relates the event of the 634 siege of that city. The play itself had premiered in the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane, although not by Mrs. Dineen's troupe, before becoming a regular choice of dramatic groups across Britain and Ireland. And it's nice to see that Carrick-on-Shore, for all its size and distance from London, had its finger on the pulse of popular entertainment. Dramatic and musical events were also used as a means to collect funds for the needy, and one such instance of this is the benefit performed by Mrs. O'Neill's company, which was run on the 19th of October 1795 in aid of the sick poor of the locality. The musical choice of the night was the ballad opera Love in a Village by Thomas Arne, which had premiered at the Royal Opera in Covent Garden in 1762. Once again, the little town of Carrick-on-Shore was keeping a pace with international musical tastes. Plays and operas were not the only entertainment on offer at this time, and Ryan informs us that on the 15th of May 1798, a ball was given by Thomas McCarthy to celebrate the building of his new house. About 200 revellers were present, although we are told that over 300 had been invited. Nevertheless, the lower, middle and upper floors of the house were all fully occupied. The lower and upper for tea, coffee and dancing, and the middle floor for what the writer describes as squalling, which Ryan emphasises with an exclamation mark. He further writes that there had never been such a fandango in Carrick before. These entries paint a picture of a busy, colourful, exciting, cultured, well-connected mercantile town in the middle of Ireland at the end of the 18th century. However, 1798, the year in which Thomas McCarthy's ball took place, was also the year in which a bloody rebellion occurred. And although Carrick-on-Suir was not known as a town which played a central role in this revolt, it was not immune to the rebellion's effects either. Soon, military movement became the order of the day, and under the heading militia, we learn that every road leading to Carrick-on-Suir resounded to the tramp of marching troops. The Roscommon militia, for instance, marched into town on their way to Vinegar Hill in County Wexford, the scene of a notable battle. They had with them 40 prisoners condemned as United Irishmen and were taking them to the prison ship at Duncannon, County Wexford for transportation. Under the heading Army, Ryan states that the North Cork militia, quartered in Carrick-on-Suir since the 26th of June 1798, was marched off on the 26th of August of the same year. They were under the command of Lord Kingsmore, the man, the writer informs us, who was credited with the invention of the pitch cap torture. When the militia left, we are told the people of Carrick did not feel much afflicted for this loss. It would seem that along with being a centre point for news, trade and cultural exchange, Carrick-on-Suir had now also become a military axis. However, despite all the immediate distractions of local troop and prisoner movements, James Ryan was still very much up to date on events which were occurring nationally. He writes that on the 26th of August 1798, the same day the North Cork militia left Carrick-on-Suir, accounts arrived into the town that the French were landing at Sligo. Further accounts stated that one of the French transports had been taken by the English and was being brought into Cork with 250 prisoners. Ryan continues with saying that the French ship was said to have had 50 guns and 1,000 men on board. The French had marched to Castlebar, where they attacked with some success, but by the 10th of August, accounts were received in Carrick-on-Suir that the French had surrendered, and those rebels who had joined with them were cut to pieces and dispersed. One might also surmise from the date of these entries that the moving of the North Cork militia out of Carrick-on-Suir was related to the French events. It appears that throughout all of this upheaval, Ryan continued to keep himself very well informed, even though at times the rebellion caused a delay to his acquisition of news. Nevertheless, the violence and mayhem which surrounded him, it was the non-arrival of the Dublin mail coach on the 24th and 25th of May 1798, which irked him the most. Ryan records that this was due to a rising of insurgents at Naas and Carlow, when upwards of 300 rebels were killed. Whereas he seems to write of such a large number of deaths at one time in an offhand manner, we must remember that these were turbulent times, and as someone who kept an almost daily record of local, national and international events, it didn't do to make one's personal affiliations too clear, as one could never be sure into whose hands your diary might fall. But we can also sympathise with Ryan and understand his dependence on the mail coach, as this was his gateway to the world outside of Carrick-on-Suir. News, its acquisition, digestion and circulation was of paramount importance to Ryan, yet he never valued national or international happenings over local events. For instance, under the heading Murder, Ryan tells us that on the 10th of August 1792, the King of France's Swiss Guards and several officers of the court at Paris were assailed by the mob and butchered. Later we are told that the King of France, Louis XVI, was murdered on the 24th of January 1793. This entry is followed with the news that the French Queen, Marie Antoinette, was murdered on the 16th of October of the same year. However, to put the French Revolution into context, on the same page that Ryan broadcast this news, he wrote of another outbreak of violence. Brian Murphy's wife, he stated, was murdered on Friday night and her husband sent to jail for the murder. Brian Murphy, we learn, was later hanged for his crime. James Ryan lived in an era that preceded the invention of the internet, television, radio, or social media. Yet this never hindered him, and throughout almost 20 years, he unceasingly recorded his news, observations, advice, and other items of general interest. He never saw the fact that he lived in a small town, in a small country on the edge of Europe as a problem. Instead, he believed that living in Carrickman was an advantage, as he was in the centre of the Irish road and river network. A product of his time, James Ryan was also ahead of his time, and the legacy he has left us is a tribute to his ability to locate, distill, and narrate sometimes mundane, sometimes remarkable events, but always in a way that makes them exciting news. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Blaine Hurley, for this fascinating evocation of a particular kind of source, which I suppose we all wish we had. Certainly for the early modern period, it would be a tremendous boon for the, say, 16th and 17th century to have such a detailed record of the circulation of news and information and a particular reaction to it. Now, I'm looking at our chat for possible questions that people might have had, and well, yes. So Andrea Di Carlo is asking, does Hyde play any role in the US or among Irish American circles? Thanks in advance, he says.
Hi, sorry, and
this is obviously a question from Máire.
Yeah, so this is for me. Can I just see the question?
Yes.
Do we mean, sorry, Andrea, is this in Salah or today?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, a lot, as you can see from even from Leo Varadkar's speech when he went a few years ago to the States, they definitely would be a huge awareness of Hyde and of what he did. And I suppose even like he went when he was in America, he was so important at that stage that he was invited to the White House. And this would be common knowledge now, like he was in the White House talking to the president and talking about folklore and when sharing all his stories. So yes, definitely. He would have a huge role in Irish studies in the States as well as here in Ireland too.
So certainly Joe Biden would be aware of him.
He definitely should be. And if he isn't, Liam and I will send him a letter. We'll send him an email later on and tell him that he definitely should and that he should quote Hyde as well in all his speeches.
Now that's impact. Okay. So that seems to be, right. Joel Herman is asking, yes.
Yeah, thanks so much. My question was for Professor Mac Mathúna about Tyg and just about the reception he got in Dublin's public sphere, and whether the Anglo-Irish reacted at all to his writing, or whether there was any of that. Just interested in Irish language in the Dublin public sphere in the 18th century. So I was just wondering. Thank you.
Yeah, I might answer Brendan's question too. There is one reference anyway to Swift incising a poem on the diamond ring or whatever on the window pane in Chester in 1728. There isn't a great deal. There's some people have written on the possible connection between Swift and O'Neill circles, the translation of Clairach and the Rourke and so forth. So there were connections, and there were, for example, Anthony Raymond now would be a common friend, as it were. He was, well, he was, say, a friend. He was an acquaintance of Swift, and he was also very much involved with the O'Neill circle in Dublin. But it's really more Táig O'Neill and others in his circle observing what was in the public sphere, rather than or having much information about how the majority English speakers were, how much they were aware of what was happening with Irish. And in fact, even within Irish, you have to say that there was the language shift may have started in the 20s, so 1720 on, among the the better off Irish, as Táig mentions that, or Irish, native Irish. Táig mentions that, but there seems to be the Catholic community north of the Liffey, further near, and that seems to have been more English speaking. That there's more work to be done, and there's some, for example, Táig has a poem about his own son Peadar, who eventually went to Spain to become a Jesuit. In a poem he wrote when Peadar was setting off, he recounts all the people who had been his teachers over the years, and I think that the teachers may form a link between, within the Catholic community anyway, between Irish speakers and English speakers. Now, Abui Macritty, a poet from Clare, who was in altercations and so forth with Richard Cox, he would be one of the very few Irish speakers who made it into print and so forth. He published a book in 1717 on the history of Ireland, based largely on Keating, but he also was involved with very much with a dictionary in Paris, for example, and some other works. But it's interesting that there aren't more connections. That's of course part of the that is one of the research conundrums or questions. But people, you can have communities alongside each other without a great deal of interaction. But you can see across all the papers how for example, the carefulness. I mean, Táig O'Neill, he mightn't have suspected that his manuscripts would fall into the wrong hands, but he never said too much, even within what he was writing. So people were circumspect. I mean, Abui Macritty may well have. He wrote quite strong stuff, or he composed quite strong material, but doesn't seem to have written it down himself. So there's a lot of circumspection.
Excellent. So at this stage, we are actually running a little bit over time. So could I ask panel members, Brendan and let's see, and Bláithín, please to answer the question posed on the chat, please. Could you answer on the chat?
Sure, let's have a look.
So we can move on to the next panel.
Yeah, does Ryan show a love towards the Irish language in his diary? It depends what you mean by a love. He doesn't ever state specifically that he has a particular graw for the language. He does, like I say, he has little interjections like that Slán Leat Bócail, and he's a few other little notes like that. He has one largish paragraph in which he writes that he's 50 years of age and he has now decided to stop wearing a wig. But that's kind of about it. He never mentions the Irish language per se. He never says that I speak, although he's very comfortable obviously writing in it, but he never mentions it or says that some people speak it and some people don't. He never goes into that.
And I think that's all the time we have for this panel. Please, there is a post-panel possibility to answer questions that have been posed in the chat. I'm asking our speakers to please have a look. You may be mentioned there, so thank you very much.